Shadows. Ooh. What's up guys? Today we're going to be talking about how to create shadows in Figma, and this is a really good skill to have when you're creating case studies, including mock-ups with your iPhone or laptop, or just shadowing behind any components in your design. So there are 4 things to consider when you're creating shadows in your design. Number 1 is the object in space. So for instance, is it an iPhone? Is it floating in space, or is it on the table? And the next thing, number 2, is the shape. So is it a circle or a sphere, a rectangle? Is it an organic shape like an apple? That'll inform the shadow as well. The third thing is the light source. So where's the light coming from? And that will also modify how you create your shadow. And the last thing is color. And one rule of thumb when painting is that you never use black. You can always create shadow with darker colors, for instance, blues or greens or purples. Okay, so we're here in Figma and we're going to start off easy with some buttons in Google Doc. So I just pasted some of the buttons here. This is the inactive button, and whenever you hover over this button, you'll get a more spread out shadow. So we're going to try to emulate that here. So I created this button here, and now we'll go to this effects section here on the right hand menu and click plus, and it'll automatically create a drop shadow, and it looks pretty good, and it's kind of giving some depth to the button now. You can actually see it, but it's not exactly what we want. The X, if we increase the number, you could see that the shadow moves to the right. And you can go negative, so it'll move the shadow to the left. So that's good to know. And then the Y axis is for up and down. So here it kind of has an even spread all around. So maybe we can do 4 for X and Y. See. And then the blur, let's make it a little bit more blurry. Oh, there we go. Okay. So it's basically just adjusting your drop shadow settings to emulate what your shadow is. Oh, there we go. So like adjusting the spread actually made it look a little bit more like the one on the right. All right, so that's looking better. Let's actually darken up the shadow, and you can actually do that here. Let's give it more of a blue undertone. So it's all about adjusting the drop shadow settings to emulate the shadow you want. Let's try to emulate this one with the drop shadow effect. Let's see. Okay, so we're almost there. I think we just need to adjust the spread and the blur. Yeah, that's pretty similar, and then the color could be lighter, and you can do that by making the transparency lighter with this bar. Alright, so that's how you use the drop shadow effect to create shadows for buttons in Figma. Okay, so now we're going to create a shadow for a device, and here's a mock-up of the Bookfinder app I created in one of my other videos. If you're interested in seeing how I created this layout, you could click on the link up there. So here we'll create a shadow, and this device is kind of like floating in the air, and you know, before even like taking to Figma, I would actually, you know, like study objects with light and shadow, like go outside and see how the light hits a tree and how that creates that cast shadow on the cement. And, you know, as the sun moves, like see where the shadow moves, and, you know, try to learn about how light affects shadow and objects. And you can even do that with a flashlight inside and your phone and see how you can manipulate where the shadow is. So I'll put up an example so you can actually see what I'm talking about. But for now, we'll just jump in and create a shadow for this device. It's also good to work off a reference as well after kind of like researching how shadows work. So here we can just actually use the pen tool to actually create, I would say maybe like a rectangular shape. And we'll create a fill for it, so just so we can see it at first. And actually I want to round the edges a bit, so maybe 30. Oh, oops, that's the rotation. Here it is. So I'm getting my even a little bit more. Yeah, that looks good. And then, oh, and it's already behind the mock-up, so that's good. So we created this object here. I'll make sure I'm highlighting it. All right, so I'm gonna name this shadow so I don't get lost. And let's actually add an effect. When you click here, the default one is drop shadow. Let's do layer blur, and that will actually blur this whole object. So let's see what 40. Yeah, 40 look 48. All right, that's looking good. All right, and we don't need a stroke for the shadow, so we can just remove that. The fill, so we could actually give it like a blue tint, and it'll actually work well because we have some blue on the device as well in the mock-up, so it'll actually be a more of a harmonious shadow. Yeah, so and you don't want to go too dark, or that'll be it won't look as realistic. So since this is kind of hovering off the ground, it'll actually be a lighter shadow versus if it was just like flat on the surface. And if it was like flat closer to the surface of, say, the table, then the shadow color would actually be darker. Oh, this looks good, like right about there. And you can even play with the transparency too, to kind of integrate the shadow with the background. Okay, that looks pretty good. And you could even tweak even more to modify your shadow to make it look more realistic to the shape. So here I have some pastel cards. I was playing around with the shadows of these. So for these, they look like they're like up higher than the ones that have the larger shadow. It gives the perspective of this card being higher in space than this card, where this card looks like it's more closer to the surface just because of the way the shadow is darker and more spread out. And I was kind of exploring different ways that we can use different colors in shadows. Typically when you're creating a shadow, it's good to know that all shadows have blue in them, but you can actually use the color of the object as a shadow too, and make that a darker version. So I'll show you what I mean here. So let's actually do the same yellow pastel color. And I'll just go ahead and grab that. This is a drop shadow here, so let's just remove it and actually try to emulate what we did here. And what I did was actually I copied the card, and I made sure it was underneath the first card, and then I also made it darker. I didn't change the hue, but I made it darker, so it's actually, it looks like it's actually casting that shadow from that object because it's taking in some of that local color. And then the light source, I suppose, is coming from up above, so we'll just move it up here like this. And actually we'll have to make it smaller too. I'm gonna actually increase it so you guys can see. That's better. Then adjust the layer blur. Just try 40. Okay, that looks good. And this is looking a little dark to me compared to the other ones, so let's see. Yeah, so maybe lowering the transparency, or I could even move up in the colors, but to quickly do it, I just played with the transparency. And then, so the complement color of yellow is purple, so when you put complementary colors together, they create more contrast, and they make each other pop out more. So that's why this looks, you know, so much more interesting and pleasing than this one. This one works. You can use it as is, but if you wanted to add a little bit more contrast and interest to your shadow, you can add the opposite or complementary color of your card. So we can basically do what we did prior and copy your card and make it smaller. Make sure it's underneath the larger card, so let's make sure. And we'll use purple. And we'll add that layer blur effect, and let's do 40. All right, that looks good. Yeah, and that's how I kind of created this interesting shadow here. Two different layers of shadow. And here we'll do a bonus where we'll do some shadows for this bottle so it looks like a real object. And one thing about shadows is that they act as a mirror. So like, for instance, if you like imagine a mountainscape and a lake, you can see the reflection of the mountain in the lake, and it's actually like a upside down mountain. So that's also how shadows work. So basically here you can see it's just the mirror image of the bottle, but turned 180 degrees. So let's get into it. I'll show you how to create this here. So I'll just actually make a copy of this by pressing down Alt and dragging out, and I'll make another copy it and invert it here. All right, so that looks about fine. And then since it's an image, we still have the effects. We can do a blur, but we also have these options here. We could play with the exposure, make it lighter or darker. Yeah, let's try to make it lighter. So yeah, if you click on image, you can play with these different filters. Under layer, we have it as pass through, normal, not much of a difference. But multiply is interesting. So, and multiply basically multiplies the color, the base color and the blending color, and it's typically darker. But since we added exposure, it looks lighter at 100%. So if we decrease this filter of multiply, it actually lightens it up even more. Yeah, so we get that kind of glass mirror effect. And yeah, so it kind of looks like it's on top of a glass table. And you can even adjust this to like make it smaller if you don't want the whole bottle. And here, you know, if I were to make it this smaller, I would actually add a layer blur and actually blur it out a little bit more. 36. So by playing with the different filters like multiply and exposure and the blur layer, you can get this really neat looking shadow that emulates the colors of the object. So thank you so much for joining. Let me know in the comments what other types of tutorials you want to see, and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you. Bye.